George VI, the prince who was never meant to be king.
As a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was.
Terrorised by his father, George V, and overshadowed by his gregarious elder brother and heir to the throne, Edward.
George VI was the complete opposite of his brother Edward. He was reserved, he was anxious, he was shy, he was dutiful.
And to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
But following Edward's shocking abdication, the stammering Prince Albert endeavoured to fulfil his duty to his country, to win over his public and deal with the chaos wrought by the Second World War.
In this moment of crisis, the British public, I think, were looking for leadership not just from the government, but also from the British royal family. They were looking for reassurance that everything would be okay and that the nation would get through this moment of peril.
Prince Albert was born in the winter of 1895, the second eldest son to King George V and Mary of Teck. The shy prince, known as Bertie to his family, grew up in the shadow of his elder brother, Prince Edward.
George VI was quiet as a child. He had a good relationship with his other siblings, but he wasn't as excitable as his older brother, Edward. Albert was a more withdrawn figure, closer to his father than his other brothers, and in keeping with his father's interests, he enjoyed the quiet life away in the countryside, out of the public eye.
Illnesses and a lack of confidence plagued Bertie's childhood. The young prince suffered the indignity of wearing leg braces, and at the age of 8, he began to develop a stammer, an ailment which would haunt him for most of his life.
George VI was the opposite of his brother Edward growing up. He was Albert, he was known as Bertie. He was shy, he was retiring, while his brother was outgoing. He wasn't as good looking as Edward, he wasn't as well dressed, he wasn't as charismatic, he didn't have the same success with women.
Edward's relationship with his younger brother Bertie was very warm when they were younger boys. There was very little between them in terms of their age, and they grew up best of friends. However, as the two men grew older, life became a bit more difficult. George had a very specific way that he wanted to live. He was much more of a kind of private figure. He was more withdrawn in terms of his public image. He didn't have the sort of the charisma and the glamour that was possessed by his older brother Edward. He didn't have a great deal of confidence. And the reason why he didn't have a great deal of confidence was because he had a stammer. Now, psychologists have sought to try and explain the stammer in relation to the fraught relationship that the royal children had with the king, with their father, George V, growing up. The young Bertie growing up had been almost terrified by his father and the expectations that his father had imposed on him.
George V was very much an old-fashioned patriarch. He was somebody who believed not just in the idea of spare the rod and spoil the child, but also in the very Victorian idea that children should be seen and not heard. So of his 4 sons, the 2 eldest, later Edward VIII and George VI, had a very difficult relationship with him because he was this cold figure and his wife Mary was cold as well. And it was very much a sense that everyone was brought up in a way to understand duty, and the idea of duty as the central tenet of what you were suspected to do as a royal prince was something that he laboured home intensively.
As a young man, Albert attended the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, and at the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, he was dispatched with the Collingwood and was present at the Great Naval Battle of Jutland in the summer of 1916.
He served in World War I. He was somebody who was the first member of his own family to have done so, to have served on active service. He had a great respect for the armed forces, and you can see that if he never had become king, he would have been one of those figures within the royal family who was always well-liked, whose debilitating stammer meant that public speaking was a nightmare for him. But in private life, he was absolutely fine. He wasn't somebody who was affected by it to the extent that he was publicly.
He didn't have a great deal of confidence. He wasn't as outgoing as other members of his family, and a bit more withdrawn. I think in that respect, we can understand why later on he would be a more reluctant figure when it came to becoming king.
As a character, he was a much less likely king than Edward ever was, because he was somebody who didn't seem to be very comfortable around people.
Without freedom, there can be no enduring peace, and without peace, no enduring freedom.
By 1920, the 25-year-old Prince Albert would start looking for a wife and would find her in his longtime friend, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. The couple were married on the 26th of April 1923 in Westminster Abbey and became the Duke and Duchess of York.
Bertie found his closest confidant and greatest supporter in his wife, Elizabeth. After a number of unsuccessful attempts to woo her and propose marriage to her, she eventually consented and agreed to marry him. There was some talk at the time about whether she was in fact more interested in his older brother, Edward, Prince of Wales, and that was one of the reasons why she originally turned Bertie down. Nevertheless, she would get married to Bertie. They would embody everything that was best about the monarchy in this period, in that they presented themselves as very dutiful figures. They went out into public life, they toured towns and cities, they opened hospitals, they did all that was expected of royals of their generation.
His relationship with his wife, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who later became Queen Elizabeth, was, one doesn't want to sentimentalise these things, but it was a very happy relationship. The two of them had known each other for many years, very, very much in love. It was a very conventional match. There was no question that they would get married. They got married and had 2 daughters. And essentially it gave him a stability and a happiness that he'd always wanted.
1923, he wed the lovely Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon in the wedding of the season. Together they toured the various dominions of the empire and seemed supremely happy. As the Duke of Kent, without the heavy sword of kingly responsibilities hanging over his head, young George led a carefree life. Possessing the common touch, he soon became a beloved figure in English life.
George VI, when he was a younger man, was devoted to his wife Elizabeth, the Queen, and to their children Elizabeth and Margaret. He was not somebody who was seeking the limelight. He was not somebody who wanted to have his name up in lights. He was somebody who would have much preferred a quiet, simple family life.
(1936), the year that changed everything. On the 20th of January, King George V died suddenly at home in Sandringham House. The monarch's 25-year reign had seen the country through the First World War and the founding of the House of Windsor. However, with George V's last breath came chaos and instability.
George V was a king who had to deal with a series of crises that coloured his reign, ranging from the First World War to the rise of communism and fascism, the Great Depression, and latterly the fragmentation of the empire. He was a king who had to move with the times. He did so by presenting himself as a figure of duty, who took his responsibilities as king very seriously, who put the nation ahead of his own desires.
King Edward VIII ascended to the throne upon the death of his father. Though the young and fashionable king was much loved by the public, both palace and parliament were in agreement that he was not well suited to the job.
It has been an ancient tradition of the British monarchy that the new sovereign should send a message. Science has made it possible for me to make that written message more personal and to speak to you all over the radio. Feel that his death is not only an overwhelming grief to my mother and to us, his children, but that it is at the same time also a personal loss to you all. The vast crowds speech to say that he reigned in the hearts of his people. It now falls upon me to succeed him and to carry on his work. I am better known to most of you as the Prince of Wales, as a man who has had the opportunity of getting to know the people of nearly every country of the world. And although I now speak to you as the king, I am still that same man whose constant effort it will be to continue to promote the well-being of his fellow men. May the future bring peace and understanding throughout the world, and may we be worthy of the heritage which is ours.
God save the King!
Well, when his father died, he greeted his father's death with absolute hysteria, and he was throwing things around and shouting and unable to respond to it. And I think a lot of people thought this was a very bad omen of what was to come, and they were proved right. Because Edward VIII is, in my opinion, the worst king who ever sat on the throne. He was somebody of quite a staggering self-absorption, mixed with a little light treachery. And I think that what he tried to do to the monarchy, if he had stayed on the throne any longer, would have systematically ruined it as an institution.
Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, was standing at a point-to-point with the courtier Tommy Lascelles, and Edward was doing one of his point-to-point rides, and Tommy Lascelles turned to Stanley Baldwin and said, "You know, sir, I often think that when we're waiting for the result of the point-to-point to come in, the best thing that could happen would be to hear that the Prince of Wales had fallen and broken his neck." And Baldwin replied, "God forgive me, so do I."
Even before Edward became king, there was a general sense that he was a security risk, and the main reason why he was seen as a security risk were that his links with the Nazi Party, his friendship with von Ribbentrop, who would later become British ambassador, were seen as enormous potential threats to national security. At a time of great international unrest, the last thing that Britain needed was a king whose personal and indeed political motives were seen as suspect.
The king had been having an affair with a twice-divorced American socialite, Wallis Simpson. In the year he became monarch, Edward VIII proposed to marry Wallis, an event which triggered a constitutional crisis across the British Empire.
When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. You could essentially summarise it like this. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw the king having this relationship with a married woman and indeed a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable. The working classes didn't think anything of this. They thought it was absolutely fair enough, that they loved the king, they wanted him to be happy, and they were very, very keen that he remain on the throne.
Edward made a speech immediately after he abdicated to the British people via the BBC radio airwaves.
But at long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
King George VI was crowned the following year in May 1937, the third and final king to reign in the year of 3 kings. Bertie was thrust to the forefront of the royal family, and with him, his wife became queen, and his 2 young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, became next in line to the throne. The 4's cosy family life changed dramatically from that moment onwards.
We know that Bertie, as Edward's younger brother, was very anxious about becoming king. He wasn't a public figure on the same level as his brother had been. He wasn't very good in front of the cameras. He struggled to make speeches. He was a reluctant monarch in that respect, and he knew that becoming king would mean that he had to put his home life, his family, on the back burner, that he had to embrace duty, responsibility now first and foremost.
Bertie was a better mould of king. He was going to be more dutiful. He had a more stoic, traditional wife in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. In fact, Edward didn't cause collapse in the country. It was better for the country that he wasn't king.
The unexpected monarch faced the tough challenge of winning over his public. The people had taken a shine to the charismatic Edward. George now desperately needed to make himself as relevant and charming as his older brother.
Given how popular Edward had been, after he left, there was a great sense of disappointment, and a cloud hanged heavy over the British monarchy. And actually, George VI, the new king, he was really overshadowed by his brother, now titled the Duke of Windsor, through the early years of his reign. He had to do much to win back the loyalty and affection of the greater British public.
George VI is something else altogether. He was somebody who was completely ill-equipped for the job, which he never thought he'd have to do. He was somebody who was terrified by the responsibilities that came along with it. But what he had, which served him exceptionally well later, was first of all his father's sense of duty and his father's sense of the monarchy as something sacred. But he also had the ability to listen to people, which his brother never did. And that was what was so crucial.
In 1914, the call came. The trial was made.
King George and Queen Elizabeth quickly turned their hands to diplomatic relations. Elizabeth's confidence and people skills complemented George VI's quiet temperament. The pair soon became a united force in a turbulent era.
I think that she was very good for him because he was nervous and anxious, and she was quite literally the power behind the throne.
In 1938, tensions between Germany and Britain were high.
Friedlieben und aber auch tapferlich. Und ihr müsst friedfertig sein.
A peaceful solution of the Czechoslovak problem is an essential preliminary to a better understanding between the British and the German peoples. And that in its turn is the indispensable foundation of European peace.
After Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler, the King and Queen invited the Prime Minister to appear on the Buckingham Palace balcony with them. This public association of the monarchy with a politician was completely unexpected and exceptional. Less than a year later, the King extended his reach across the Atlantic. President Franklin D. Roosevelt invited George VI for a visit to the United States, and the event soon held much significance. Until then, no reigning British monarch had ever set foot on American soil, not even in colonial times. King George and Queen Elizabeth reveled in their newfound popularity in America. The meeting of the monarch and the US president became a modern tradition from then on. On the morning of the 3rd of September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain addressed the nation by radio broadcast. With the failure of the German government to withdraw their troops from Poland, the UK was now at war with Nazi Germany. Only 3 years into his sudden ascent to the throne, George, who was still seeking to gain the favour of his people, would now face a Second World War, this time as king.
The day that war was declared against Germany was a great moment of sadness and concern for the British public. They understood why this point had been reached, that Hitler had time and again broken promises, and as a result, Chamberlain and Chamberlain's government had been forced to declare war on Germany. In this moment of crisis, the British public, I think, were looking for leadership not just from the government, but also from the British royal family. They were looking for reassurance that everything would be okay and that the nation would get through this moment of peril.
Sure I am that this day, now, we are the masters of our fate. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
the King and Queen refused to flee to Canada, even at the height of the Blitz. Instead, the royal couple made themselves visible and relatable in the face of a nationwide crisis.
What George VI realised in World War II was that it was a conflict like Britain had never known before. It was a conflict which was going to be fought not just in terms of battlefields and across the world, but it's also going to be fought via the media. It was going to be fought in recorded speech, it's going to be fought in newsreels. It's very important that you had to look the right way, because every time that he was being filmed, it was something that was being distributed around the world. And a lot of Britain's allies, or putative allies, such as America, were looking at Britain, especially after the fall of France in 1940. The questions that they were asking are, do we let Britain stand alone? Do we let Britain fight on their own? Or do we actually try and help them? Is this worth our getting involved in? So George was aware that in addition to being his country's king, he was also acting as a kind of global ambassador.
In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas, this message, spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you, as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war. Over and over again, we have tried to find a peaceful way out of the differences between ourselves and those who are now our enemy.
At the start of the war, there was a real concern at the palace that the British monarchy didn't really have a role to play in this war, that it could offer leadership by visiting troops, for example, but that it didn't really have a stage to perform on, as had been the case during the First World War. Then in the summer of 1940, as the bombing raids on London begin and the German Luftwaffe blitzing people's homes, factories, and other towns and cities across the country, this, if you like, is the great opportunity for the British royal family, because suddenly they have a role to play. They go out visiting members of the public who have been bombed out of their homes, who have been working through the night to help those who are suffering as a result of the air raids. And the King and Queen see their roles as something of morale boosters. They are there to provide reassurance to the public, to recognise the hard work and effort that is going in to fighting this war on the home front. So it's a different kind of leadership to the wars of before, in that George and his wife Elizabeth's roles were much more focused on Britain and the home front.
Buckingham Palace was bombed on several occasions in World War II. The most spectacular one came relatively early in the war, when bombs landed sufficiently close to George VI and to Queen Elizabeth and to their Private Secretary Alec Harding, but if it hadn't been for a couple of minor bits of chance, they almost certainly would have been killed. After the palace was bombed, they're both absolutely terrified. The king wrote in his diary that he couldn't quite believe what had happened and that he was very lucky to have escaped. But days later, he's still writing, "I look outside and I can't forget seeing the bomb." And it's quite clear that it had a kind of traumatic effect on both of them. There was a real sense of the traditional bounds coming down, a real sense that they were all in it together.
the British people welcomed the end of the Second World War. Fathers, brothers and sons could come home again. However, with peacetime comes new challenges, new instabilities, and new ways of thinking.
Germany, the enemy who drove all Europe into war, has been finally overcome. But at this hour, when the dreadful shadow of war has passed far from our hearths and homes in these islands, we may at last make one pause for thanksgiving and then turn our thoughts to the tasks all over the world which peace in Europe brings with it. First, and let us remember those who will not come back, their constancy and courage in battle, their sacrifice and endurance in the face of a merciless enemy. Let us remember the men in all the services, the women in all the services who have laid down their lives.
The British Empire crumbled away, and the role of the British monarch began to change.
The King and Queen appear for a great reception, with Princess Elizabeth, now 19, and Princess Margaret Rose, now 15 years old. Today, Britain, emerging from the war with a proud sense of duty well done, faces the grave problems of peace.
The First and Second World Wars were disastrous for the British Empire in that they put huge pressures on the British economy. It's also the case that during the Second World War, many men come from the colonies to fight on behalf of the motherland, to fight on behalf of Britain against the forces of fascism. They believe they're fighting for democracy, for the ideals of independence and freedom. And yet, after the war is won, they return to their homes in the colonies and they still don't have their own freedom and independence. And there's something of a contradiction there, which really spurs on these independence movements in their drive for full independence. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the British Empire rapidly transitioned into the modern Commonwealth of Nations. Key moment of change involving the King is with the London Declaration of 1949, where he is given the title Head of the Commonwealth. So whereas he was once an emperor, he now has this more diffuse title, this less well-defined title, but nevertheless it's a key symbolic role at the heart of this new thing we call Commonwealth.
George VI became the first monarch to hold the title Head of the Commonwealth. He endeavoured to unify the member nations, promote equality across the former British colonies, and leave a lasting legacy for his heir. King George's health rapidly declined in the immediate years after the war. Conscious of his lack of time, he endeavoured to prepare Elizabeth for the greatest duty of her life.
I think it's fair to say that the two things that destroyed George's health and led him to an early death were first of all his becoming king at all, and secondly the sheer stress of what he had to do in World War II, because if a war had never happened, if a peace had been sought with Hitler that had then been agreed, he may have lived longer, but he was faced with the most horrendous stress and pressure. You can understand why. If you've been faced with that level of trauma, it's not going to be something you can walk away from very easily.
George VI, who had, as a young man, often suffered from ill health, became quite ill as a result of the Second World War. The stress of the conflict told on him. He was a heavy smoker, and by 1945, his health was actually very poor.
George knew that he was very ill towards the end of his life. He knew that he was a committed cigarette smoker. He was somebody he'd always drunk quite heavily as well. He was somebody who knew that his health was not great. But on the other hand, he was being told by his doctors that operations that he'd had were successful. I mean, he had a large portion of his lung removed, that he was going to be okay. So the fact that he was dying was kept from him, but it was also commonly known within the wider echelons of the courtiers that he didn't have all that long, and that Elizabeth was likely to become queen far before anyone could have reasonably expected.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me.
On the 20th of November 1947, George VI's heir and firstborn daughter married Prince Philip Mountbatten of Greece and Denmark. But when the young princess embarked on a tour of Kenya with her husband in 1952, she never expected to return as queen. On the 6th of February 1952, George VI passed away in his sleep at the Sandringham estate, only 7 years after the largest conflict in history had drawn to a close. The nation mourned its beloved king.
Before the Queen, his daughter, the widowed Queen, his wife, as George VI returns to his sorrowing capital. And with it, on the oak coffin, is the white wreath of his widow.
George VI embraced change more than any other monarch before him. He came into power when the crown was in a time of crisis and steered the country through a turbulent period when the world was in the midst of change.
I think we can see throughout George VI's reign, there's a pattern. There's this incredibly difficult thing which has to be overcome. George was not felt to be up to it, and then through a combination of strength of character, listening to people, and sometimes just luck, it always was overcome, and that was a fascinating run of luck, if you like.
He instilled this sense of duty into both his family and his daughter, who would become Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history.
George had been preparing Elizabeth to one day succeed him as the British monarch and as head of Commonwealth. The way he'd done this is to essentially demonstrate to her what the role of monarch required, and also give her opportunities to begin to develop her own public role. For example, her position in the ATS at the end of the Second World War was a way that she embraced a new public role, demonstrating that she was committed to service and duty. A number of other roles followed. She would accompany her parents on tours. during the immediate post-war years, where she went out and was learning, if you like, the ropes of how to be young and royal.
I think that the greatest legacy of King George VI is actually his daughter. I think that she's always reigned very much as her father's daughter. She's reigned as somebody who has prized constancy, stability, good humour, an ability to connect with people in a way that they've always found reassuring, and also a sense that monarchy has to be something of a continuation. The Queen has never been somebody who has seen the monarchy as an opportunity to showboat, unlike her uncle. She's seen monarchy as a duty, and I think that is very much her father's influence. He was faced with the most horrendous situation that anybody has faced with in the 20th century, and he was a successful king during it. And despite his ill health, despite his stammer, despite his shyness, despite his character, he was able to instill in his children, especially his eldest daughter, a sense that this is how you conduct yourself, this is how the royal family has to behave, and we see his influence every day today.
Through the chaos of war and the founding of the Commonwealth of Nations, King George VI carried his country and people out of the ashes and into the light of the modern world.